You've probably heard of this classic experiment. It seems like someone from every middle school science fair project in the past 100 years has done this exact experiment. And the experiment goes, if you take a lot of different plants and you put different colors of light, which color of light will have the greatest increase in plant growth, right? A lot of middle schoolers think, oh, the green light, plants are green, they must like green light. Some people say, oh, yellow or blue, I don't know. Well, what do they get? What do we find out every single time? Why is it that the green light doesn't work like people think it does? In this podcast, we'll get to the bottom of that issue. Plants need a certain color of light. Let's find out which one. Let's get started. So when we're talking about plants, as you know, undergo photosynthesis. Well, what is photosynthesis? Basically, photosynthesis is a plant or some cyanobacteria, some other photosynthesizing organism, using the sun's energy to make glucose and oxygen, right? The plants give us oxygen, they make glucose, that's what's in the plant. And that formula, as you can see, is right here. If we take some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we water our plants, they get some energy from the sun, some light energy, they make sugar and oxygen, right? Basic photosynthesis equation. Well, this is actually all a cycle if you think about it, because then heterotrophs undergo cellular respiration. So we, right, animals, other organisms, right, take this cellular respiration, they take the glucose and the oxygen and undergo cellular respiration and give off CO2 and water. Right, so this is basically a circle. Now, what's the point of this? Why do heterotrophs break down glucose, use oxygen, and produce CO2 and H2O, right? Well, the main point, as we've seen in the last videos that we've watched, is all about cellular respiration, making ATP. The formula, of course, for cellular respiration, glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. If you notice, these are the exact opposite, right? Here we're taking CO2, water, to make glucose and oxygen. Here, cellular respiration, animals, we take glucose and oxygen and make CO2. So sort of the circle of life, the energy cycle. We rely on plants to provide us oxygen, and then the plant, of course, is made up of a lot of glucose. We then eat that, digest it, use the oxygen to undergo cellular respiration. Now, plants do also undergo cellular respiration, but their primary mode of energy is, of course, from photosynthesis. So that's what we're looking at in this video. We're going to look at photosynthesis, specifically the first part of photosynthesis, the light reactions. So let's get a little deeper into the plant. So we know plants, of course, they need their sunlight. So plant needs a few things. One, sunlight. And they have these, or at least most plants do, leaves. And what is the function of leaves? If you think about it, leaves are just giant solar collectors. They're basically taking a lot of surface area. If you think about a leaf, it's really, really thin, but a lot of surface area. And that's so that we can maximize the surface area to receive that sunlight. Then in the leaves, we'll also find that there are stomata. So if you take a particular leaf and you look at it, you'll notice that there are these small openings called stomata, or stomates, plural, where gas exchange occurs. So notice that this one's closed over here, closed stomata. These are surrounded by these guard cells here. You also have an opened stomata that gas can go in and out of. So these guard cells surround the stomata. This is really the site of gas exchange. Plants also, of course, need water. Where do they get that water from? Of course, from the roots. So water is taken up through the plant, through the roots, and then it is available to provide the needed water that the plant needs for photosynthesis. And then, of course, finally, we also will say that plants will need some additional nutrients. If you think about what do you have to do to your plant? Yes, you have to water it, you have to give it sun, and then also you'll have to fertilize it, give it some nutrients. So plants need some other nutrients in the soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, things like that, so that they continue to grow and photosynthesize as well. So looking a little deeper into the plant, we'll talk about the organelle that is responsible for photosynthesis, right? The chloroplast is where photosynthesis occurs. Found in plant cells, right, and some other photosynthesizing organisms like cyanobacteria. What we find is that the chloroplast has a few special features. We've looked at a few of these before when we looked at all the general organelles, but I want to remind you of a few. Chloroplasts have a double membrane, so you see the outer membrane and the inner membrane. In between the outer membrane and the inner membrane is the intermembrane space. There's a fluid that fills the chloroplast, and that's called the stroma. The stroma is not the same thing, equals not the stomata. Don't get those confused. The stroma is the liquid portion of the chloroplast. The stomata, or stomates, are the openings in those leaves for gas exchange. You will also notice that we have these thylakoid membranes, right? There's a membrane, there's a membrane, there's a membrane. You'll see there's a lot of membrane, right? This is all about the membranes. Why? More membranes, more surface area, more reactions can occur. So the stroma, this liquid portion, is where the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis is going to take place. The thylakoid sacs, or these thylakoid membranes, is where our electron transport chain, the light reactions, will take place. If you take a stack of these thylakoids, that's called a granum. Okay? Stack of thylakoids called a granum. Okay, so that is the internal structure of the chloroplast. In that chloroplast, right, when we draw them, they're often green. What makes them green? Well, these pigments in the chloroplasts, on these thylakoids, you can see, they're green. That's because the thylakoid membrane, so if we take this stack and we move it up here, okay, if you're looking at one of these, they actually have embedded in them several pigments, right? What pigment is it? What is it that makes this green? Well, it's actually the pigment chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is that particular pigment that is in photosynthesis, that's in these thylakoid membranes, that allows photosynthesis to take place. We also call it a photosystem, right? Photo, think light. So this is basically a light gathering system, and they're embedded in these thylakoid membranes. All right, well, what is this pigment? Oh, there's a complicated chemical formula, right? So these green pigments, chlorophyll, and there are many different types. This one here happens to be chlorophyll A. I think last time I looked, we're up to like chlorophyll F, maybe chlorophyll A, B, C, D, E. We have a lot of different molecules of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A we see primarily, right, as one of the main photosynthesizers. This molecule, as you see, has magnesium at the center of its ring. And in the enzyme unit, we talked about the fact that magnesium was a cofactor in this chlorophyll molecule. So the pigments, in this case chlorophyll, that is the site, helps us with photosynthesis, and these are embedded there in the thylakoid membrane. There are a few other pigments that we don't talk about as much because chlorophyll A is the primary one, but you'll see some of those other pigments come through in the fall when the leaves start to change color. So, light absorption. I mentioned in the very first slide that photosynthesis absorbs only certain wavelengths of light, or certain colors of light. And that's all because chlorophyll A, that dominant pigment, absorbs best red and blue wavelengths, and least in the green. How do we know this? Well, we can actually do an experiment where you extract chlorophylls, right? So you extract some chlorophyll, and then you put it in a fancy machine called a photometer or a photospectrometer. And basically what that's doing is it will analyze the absorption of light. So you send light through the chlorophyll molecules. Some of it might be absorbed, some might be reflected. Well, what we find is that chlorophyll absorbs here in the blue wavelengths, right? See that? And also in the red wavelengths. That's what it absorbs. Notice the green, though, does not absorb the green light. Well, and that actually makes sense if you think about it. A lot of our plants are green because they reflect green back to your eyes, right? So if you think of the sun or white light that has all colors of the spectrum in, right? Roy G. Biv, starting here, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. If you think about white light having all of those colors, well, when that light hits the chlorophyll molecules, the green part of that spectrum is reflected back to your eyes. That's why you see plants as green. But they can't actually use that green light. They reflect it back to you. What they're absorbing is the red and the blue wavelengths. So in this classic experiment, don't even mess with the green light bulb. We know plants cannot use that green pigment, at least most plants. Okay, so let's get into some of the detailed overview of photosynthesis. So I said that photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. There are two big reactions that we want to talk about: the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Let's start with the light-dependent. This just makes sense. Light-dependent reactions depends on, you knew it, light. So this is taking the free energy available from the sun and basically giving us some ATP, and then our electron carrier, NADPH, to run the Calvin cycle later. Notice the difference. The electron carrier in photosynthesis is NADPH. If you remember back to cellular respiration, it was just NADH, right? But in photosynthesis, we add the P. So this is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Basically what you find is there is an extra phosphate. So light reactions, of course, are taking place in this thylakoid membrane. So the sun, lights, photons come down. Water is used, right? We have to water our plants in the light reactions. And then the light reactions produce oxygen for us. Well, the other important thing, as I told you, the light reactions yield ATP and NADPH. ATP, you know, is our energy currency. NADPH is our electron carrier. That's going to then be cycled over to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle then is going to use this chemical energy made from the light reactions to build molecules, right? To build the plant. If you think about a plant, it's really just a bunch of sugar molecules rearranged. Remember back to polysaccharides and carbohydrates that we talked about. Those are just big polysaccharides of small monomer sugars like glucose. And so the Calvin cycle will take the ATP energy and those electron carriers that have been regenerated, take in CO2 from our atmosphere, and then use it to make sugar. The specific sugar that's the output of the Calvin cycle is G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. You may also recognize that from cellular respiration. Then, once the ATP is used, once the electrons have been taken from NADPH, it then sends those back over to be regenerated. So you'll notice ADP, because the ATP was used, and then NADP plus, positive charge, because that electron had been taken from it to use in the Calvin cycle. Okay, so general overview of photosynthesis. Two main reactions: the light-dependent reactions taking place in the thylakoid, the Calvin cycle taking place in the stroma of the chloroplast. The Calvin cycle relies on the ATP and NADPH produced, sends it back over. All right, so what we're doing today in this video is, for the last half of this video, I'm really going to go deep into the light-dependent reactions. So, I mentioned earlier this idea of a photosystem. A photosystem is really just a system of gathering light. And what is it really? It's just a bunch of chlorophyll molecules hanging out there on the membrane. There are two photosystems that we're going to talk about here that are in the thylakoid membrane: photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Now, photosystem 2 uses chlorophyll A, and chlorophyll A, we know, absorbs specifically red wavelength of light at 680 nanometers. So let's get our bearings. So here's our chloroplast, right? You're looking at here. We're inside the chloroplast. And what you're looking at right here is the membrane of a thylakoid. So this is inside the thylakoid, then this would be the stroma of the chloroplast, all right? So we're looking at one of these thylakoid membranes. Embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid is a photosystem. This one happens to be photosystem 2. So when light comes down, it will activate these chlorophyll molecules. They've got little electrons that we're going to see. So if we take that and sort of blow it up and look at it out here, when light from the sun or your light bulb hits these chlorophyll molecules, these electrons will start bopping around chlorophyll molecules. That light is what causes those electrons to move. Eventually, those electrons will arrive on two really important chlorophyll molecules, right? The two main chlorophyll molecules, we call them P680. These are the ones that absorb specifically that 680 nanometers of light. Once they get here, then those electrons will be sent to something called the primary acceptor. That primary acceptor will then send things down the electron transport chain that we're going to look at here in a moment. Okay? So this seems complicated because it is. Basically what I want you to understand here is that photosystems are just systems of chlorophyll that take the light and then the electrons get excited, bounce around until they finally get to an acceptor to go down the electron transport chain, which we're going to look at here in a moment. Photosystem 1 is very similar, except we see that it uses chlorophyll B, another red wavelength of light, 700 nanometers, but this actually results in a different function than this that we'll see here in a moment. So those are the two photosystems, 2 and 1, that we're going to talk about. 2 uses chlorophyll A, photosystem 1 uses chlorophyll B. Okay, so this is where it gets pretty complicated. We're going to talk specifically about the electron transport chain, abbreviated ETC, of photosynthesis. So what is this electron transport chain? Basically what's happening here, and I'm going to show you an image, but here, these are the words. Electrons will pass through the electron transport chain, establishing an electrochemical gradient, right? When you think gradient, think, right, one side's high, one side's low. There's a gradient, high to low, of hydrogen ions across the membrane, and this is linked to the synthesis of ATP. There should be a little space there. Okay, let's look at it. All right, so get our bearings again. We're in the chloroplast. This right here is a thylakoid membrane, the membrane of one of those thylakoids in the chloroplast. Inside the thylakoid down here, in the stroma of the chloroplast up here. Okay, so embedded in the membrane of these thylakoids are all of these different chains, right? It's a chain of proteins, and you can see a lot of them here. So let me point out a few important ones. Photosystem 2 is here. Remember, that uses chlorophyll A. Photosystem 1, that uses chlorophyll B, is there. You also see ATP synthase. If we break this down, ACE, we know this is an enzyme, right? And it's probably one that maybe was going to make ATP. We also look, right, we've got some other things here. These look weird. We'll get to those in a minute. NADP reductase, also an enzyme. Oh, I wonder if it has to do with our electron carrier, NADPH. Probably. All right, we'll find out. All right, so what happens? So photosynthesis, of course, starts with light. When the light comes down, what happens is, you remember there's these chlorophyll molecules up here. The light excites the electrons in the chlorophyll molecules, and those electrons go down the electron transport chain. All right, so here they go. This is their journey, going down the chain. All right? As they do that, they essentially, you think electrons, sort of like electricity, right? The flow of electrons creates some work. Well, what happens here is they activate certain complexes. Here's a cytochrome complex here that takes hydrogens that were in the stroma and it shuttles them across. So the fact that these electrons were buzzing through here, right, it essentially turned on, activated this complex to take some hydrogens and bring them in. Now, the hydrogens come in, but something else needs to occur. Photosystem 2, if we think about it, it just lost some electrons, right? And electrons are going through the chain, going through the chain. Well, it needs to replace those electrons, right? It needs the electrons so that light can come down and buzz them again and send them through here. Well, the thing that replaces the electrons is they actually come from water. So remember, we have to water our plants. So water's here in this thylakoid space. What happens is the water split. Water splits in half, so we get some oxygen, and we actually get some hydrogen as well. So now we've got some hydrogen that's been shuttled across. Water has been split. The electrons will come back up here to regenerate those taken from the chlorophyll molecules. And the hydrogen atoms are going to start to build up, right? You got these protons. Sometimes we call H+ just a proton. So these hydrogens are now going to build up, right? All these hydrogens are going to build up inside. When that happens, we establish a gradient. Now there's a high concentration of hydrogen inside. When that happens, you know what's going to happen next. When we get a high concentration on one side of a membrane, they want to move across to go where there's less of them. So when that happens, these hydrogen ions, these protons, move across, and when they do it, they activate ATP synthase. As they activate ATP synthase will take an ADP plus a phosphate, provide the space, the energy to make ATP. This is a complicated procedure, but it's basically like a rotor machine. It just starts spinning, in other words, and that action actually provides the energy necessary for ADP and P to join to make ATP. Okay, so where are we? Light's come down, we've excited the electrons, they've moved through, we've moved the hydrogens across, water was split to replace the electrons here. Oxygen, interesting point, is now going to leave. Oxygen will leave and we can breathe it, right? So there was a question a long time ago, the oxygen that plants produce from photosynthesis, where does that come from? Well, actually, the plants split the water for you for some oxygen. So next time you're out talking to your trees, as I tend to do sometimes, thank them for splitting water so that you could breathe some oxygen. Okay, so the hydrogen's built up, turned on ATP synthase, we got ATP being made. All right, that was all from photosystem 2. So if you think about it, photosystem 2 is actually directly responsible for the buildup of the proton gradient that drives ATP synthase. Now, this enzyme here doesn't really use a substrate like we've talked about before. This is actually an oxidative process. If you remember, Leo the lion says grr. Oxidize means losing electrons. So the process of losing electrons has driven this ATP synthase to move across. So this is oxidative. I'm going to write this out because it's an important word. Oxidative phosphorylation. Because what happened was the oxidative process of losing electrons and coming over here and getting this proton gradient drove the addition of P to ADP to make here. So the phosphorylation, adding the phosphate group, actually is what made ATP. So that was photosystem 2. We made this ATP. Well, what's going on with photosystem 1? Well, photosystem 1 can work a few ways. You remember these electrons coming from over here? These can come over here, and those electrons can be made available. NADP reductase will reduce NADP to make NADPH, right? So if you take NADP, you take the electrons on the hydrogen, then we've got an activated electron carrier to go over to the Calvin cycle. The other thing that can happen is that this can actually be reactivated, and we can excite the chlorophyll molecules that are here, and photosystem 1 can actually do it on their own. Okay, so that's one way of getting an ADPH, is that these electrons are excited. And in that case, the electrons coming from PS2 would replace the ones missed there. So there's a few ways that we can get NADPH from NADP reductase. Okay, so take it all in. That was a lot. This is the electron transport chain of photosynthesis. The point of all of this was to make NADPH and ATP. How did it do it? It did it by exciting electrons, moving them down a chain, which shuttled across hydrogens, which built up a gradient so that they would then go back across and activate this enzyme ATP synthase. In the meantime, water was split to replace those electrons. We got oxygen for us to breathe and some more hydrogens to build up this gradient. So a tricky idea, photosynthesis. There are a lot of other little parts of the chain that I didn't mention, not as important as sort of these main four: synthase, reductase, PS1, and PS2. All right, let's move ahead and wrap this up. For a summary, I'm going to ask some questions, and then I want you to pause, see if you can answer these. If you printed my video guide out, right, and you're taking notes on my video guide, these questions are there for you to answer. So write down the answer in your video guide, and then I'm going to go over them. Okay, so where did the original water come from? Where did the electrons that went down the electron transport chain come from? Where did the oxygen come from? Where did the hydrogen come from? Where did the ATP come from? Where did the O2 go? What will the ATP and NADPH be used for? Okay, so pause me for a moment, see if you can answer all those questions. Okay, so did you get them all? Let's first start. Where did the water come from? Obviously the roots of the plant, right? Came up through the roots into the cells, into the chloroplast. Where did the electrons that went down the electron transport chain come from? Well, those came from chlorophyll, right? The light activated those electrons from chlorophyll. Then water was split to refill those electrons that were taken from chlorophyll. All right, where did the oxygen come from? That was from water splitting, right? Split water, you get some oxygen. Where did the hydrogen come from? Two places. From the splitting of the water, right, we got some hydrogen. And also remember, some of those hydrogen were shuttled across in the electron transport chain. Where did the ATP come from? ATP synthase was the enzyme that used the proton gradient, the hydrogens, to make ATP. Where did the oxygen go? Oh, it's going to go out of the plant, right? Out of the chloroplast, out of the plant, through the stomata into the atmosphere for us to breathe. And what is the ATP and NADPH going to be used for? They're going to be used to make sugar in the Calvin cycle. Okay? So hopefully you were able to answer all those questions. If not, maybe go back, rewatch a few of these ideas from the light reactions and photosynthesis.